All right, welcome. In this video, I want to look at the technology of convolutional neural networks, which is a popular technology that is used in image processing and in a few other areas like natural language processing and reinforcement learning. Convolutional neural networks were first used for image processing, and so they were actually inspired by observations of how visual processing is carried out in humans and in other mammals and other animals. Um, for most mammals, we have our visual cortex, part of our brain, that actually occupies the back part of your brain, so it's at the back of your skull, and it starts at the back of your eyes. Technically, there are the optic nerves that start at the back of your retina will send signals back to your visual cortex at the back of your brain, and those optic nerves are connected directly into cells in your retina that will detect the light that impacts it as it moves through your eye. The signal then is sent from special nerve cells that respond to those cells in your eye, in your retina, to send a signal through now a neural network, which we usually call the visual cortex, a particular collection of neurons that are organized in a very special way. So one thing in particular is that animal brains typically display what we call retinotopy. Retinotopy means that the spatial arrangement of the retina, so the retina you can think of as being like a little movie screen at the back of your eye where the light comes in and flashes onto that screen, and as it impacts that screen, there are specific cells there that respond to that light impact. So there's a spatial arrangement there. It's a 2D arrangement, and that 2D arrangement, of course, corresponds to the 2D arrangement of whatever it is we happen to be looking at. So we have the screen responding to some physical relation, or there's a physical relationship between the screen and what we're actually seeing, the retina and what we're seeing. Well, what retinotopy means is that in our brain and in the optic nerve, that spatial arrangement is preserved. So when we take the information in from our eye, which has a 2D arrangement, we keep a two-dimensional storage sort of that information as it is processed back. Let's contrast this. Say you want to send a signal, a 2D signal, an image, say, and you want to send it along a channel, a communication channel like the internet, along a telephone line or something like that, then typically what we do is we break that 2D image down into 1D image. We make a big long list of the data in that image and we send that along. We don't send a two-dimensional structure. We have a one-dimensional structure. So we create this when we send it. So that we could imagine that would be a possibility for the optic nerve. It could just take all that information and turn it into just one signal and sends it down. But that's not what we observe when we see the organization of the neurons in our brain. We see that the visual cortex actually has a grid of neurons that correspond to the grid of cells that we have in our eyes. And then we also notice that this grid, it responds to those signals in this spatially arranged way, but then there's another grid behind that and another behind that. There's in fact a hierarchy of levels of what look like fairly specialized organizations of neurons, because they all have this sort of two-dimensional grid shape that allow us to perceive information in a spatially organized way. And it turns out spatial organization of information is actually really important for lots of different kinds of processing. So we are keeping that information stored in that kind of broken down into small chunks so that we can process those chunks up into higher and higher information. So what does that hierarchy help us do? Well, when we observe those cells and we see what they respond to, we can do this with certain mammals. There's been some experiments done with cats, for instance, in which they would expose a cat to some sensory information, some visual information, and then they would see which cells in the visual cortex would fire in response to that particular information. And one thing that they notice is that the first layer of cells in the visual cortex tends to respond to small, simple features like detecting edges, maybe detecting simple motion, and then as you get higher up, they respond to more sophisticated and composed and complex versions of those simpler things. So if you're only detecting edges or solid patches, maybe at the first level, at the next level you might start be able to put those edges together to detect shapes. At the next level, or maybe a few layers later, you might be able to put those shapes together to identify, sophisticated objects that are built out of shapes, like maybe like a face or an animal or a car or something like that. You can now detect that by putting together the information that was already detected at a lower level. So this is really obviously a really cool way that our visual systems have already evolved to be organized, and it's really interesting to note how that organization is maintained to keep that information in a format that's going to be helpful for our brain to process it. So the first step that I want to do today is sort of take that inspiration and see, well, this is actually how convolutional neural networks have been inspired as well, and maybe you'll see some of this repeated as we explore how convolutional neural networks work. So if you haven't heard of convolutional neural networks before, maybe you've heard of them. CNNs is also what they're commonly called. They've been pretty popular for about a decade now, especially for use of image classification. That was sort of an earlier task that they have been put to, and in more recent years, it's getting into more sophisticated. Within an image, can you detect an object? Maybe can you caption an image, see what the image is? So here's a image. This is a picture of my cat Angel that I took a couple days ago, and I just wanted to use it as an example in this slide. And when I inserted it into PowerPoint, PowerPoint has a few accessibility features that help for vision impaired and hearing impaired and so on. And one of the things that it does is it tries now to automatically caption images that you put in it, to help maybe visually impaired individuals who might be looking at your slides as well. So in this particular instance, I put Angel in here, and PowerPoint asked me, he said, "Hey, do you want to add this caption to this image?" And the caption that it suggested was this one: a cat lying on a cat tree, which, to be honest, that is very accurate. So I stuck with it. I was going to put something like a cat looking out a window. Well, you can't really see the window there. She was looking out the window, but the AI that was already built into PowerPoint probably uses a convolutional neural net of some kind to actually add these recommended captioning. Now, the PowerPoint one isn't super great. It got really good on this one. I put other images in, and it wasn't quite as successful. But I accepted this one. I said, sure, that's a good example. So that's one example of the things that we use convolutional neural networks for, is taking an image like this and trying to automatically generate a caption for it that is accurate. And in this case, it happened to be successful. So a different task, and this is this sort of green box that I put on here. You might notice, if you've ever seen any kind of visual processing sort of image detection software, this is the kind of artifact that they sometimes introduce. Now I just made this up. I just put this green box in PowerPoint here. But what it will often do is try and identify where in an image a particular object is, and then identify what that object is. And then it might draw a bounding box, which is a common tool to grab something in an image. In this case, it's simple to draw a box, for instance, instead of finding the outline. Although convolutional neural networks these days are now sophisticated enough that they wouldn't just maybe draw the box around here. They would identify every pixel that is a cat pixel. And so you can actually get the AI is getting really good. Of course, we're still pushing the limits of this, but it's getting really good that it can now just identify every piece of this image that is a cat and every piece that is not. And it might be able to identify what the other things are as well. But in my example here, I've said maybe it's identified this as a cat, it's highlighted it as a cat, and then I've also put this sort of random, I made it up, random number here, 99.238. What I'm sort of indicating there is that what this object detector is doing is usually it's detecting all kinds of objects, cats, dogs, whatever. And so the first bit of information tells you which category it thinks it's found. So usually it's got a whole bunch of categories that it might find, and it thinks it's found cat. And then the second thing it tells you there is how accurate it thinks it is, or what chance it, what percent guess it has that this is actually a cat. So in this case, I'm saying that maybe it's very accurate. It thinks that this is a cat, so it thinks it's 99.238. Maybe this was, I don't know, a dog wearing a cat suit or something weird, something that's going to confuse it a little bit, then maybe that number is going to come down. Okay, or maybe it's only seeing a part of the cat, so it's not 100% sure, so maybe its confidence level will go down. So you'll see this in sort of machine learning models that do image processing. All right, I want to sort of step back to maybe a older a classification task. So classifying is just the task of taking something, an image, a character in this case, and then classifying it into what is it. So characters were an earlier task that we worked on, handwritten characters in this case, because there are a limited number of characters. So if we're just looking at words and numbers like we've got here, then you've got your alphabet and you've got your numerals. And so there's only a small finite number of categories that you actually have to look for, whereas opposed to looking at images and trying to figure out what it is, just any old image of any old thing with no promises, that's really hard. There's lots of categories. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of possible categories that you might need to look for. So in the earlier days, before we were having a lot of success at this stuff, we wanted to limit the task, and so handwritten character detection was a very common early task, and it was in fact one of the earliest successes of convolutional neural networks, which is what we're going to explore a little bit here. So one thing that convolutional neural networks they use a couple different kinds of layers, and one of those layers is called a convolutional layer, which is where the neural network gets its name from. And what this layer does is it kind of scans across the image, and it looks for patterns, and it does this, we call them filters in the neural network. And it does this to try and identify or find things. Now there's an interesting inspiration here. Again, it comes from looking at the visual cortex. In that hierarchy of cells in each layer, one thing that was noted is that some of those cells kind of do the same thing. They respond to the same shape, but just at different areas of the visual field. So we sometimes call these the receptive field of that particular cell. So we might say there's a cell, let's say it's an edge detecting cell. It's a cell that detects vertical edges, let's say. Now, that particular cell may have other cells that also detect vertical edges, but just in a different part of the receptive field. So instead of maybe in the, we can use this image here as our receptive field. Maybe some cells are responding to the vertical edges in this one, whereas other cells are responding to the vertical edges in this L, or others down in these other letters and characters down below. So because we recognize in the biological brains, that in the visual cortex, that there are these cells that kind of do the same thing but for different parts of the receptive field, that's what we've inspired to build convolutional layers, which is where we're going to have some filter that's looking for something, say these vertical edges, and we're going to pass it across the image, and whenever it finds one of those vertical edges, it's going to say, hey, I found one, and otherwise it's going to do nothing. And then we can have a collection of filters that might do this, one that does verticals, one that does maybe horizontals, one that does diagonals, and then other things too, corners and whatever it might be that you're looking for. There might be a special filter that might help it. Now, one thing I want to stress here is that these filters that we come up with are going to be learned by the network. They're not pre-stated by us. So even though I'm saying, hey, maybe we have one that has a vertical edge detection, we don't program it and say, okay, make sure there's one that has a vertical edge detection. We let it decide what it needs to detect to do the job that we want it to do. And usually edge detection is really important in all kinds of image processing. So that's why usually on these earlier levels, we see edge detection as one that pops up. So here's sort of an example of what maybe an advanced sort of high level filtering might have happened. We may have had some filter in here that detects S. And again, remember, this might happen after training. We don't pre-program it and say, we want a filter that detects S's. We say, we want you to be able to read what this says. And in order to be successful at reading what this says, you might need to know what an S is. So again, now let's imagine we've got one of these S detecting filters and we were kind of passing it over the whole image. We can think of it sort of passing over each line because that's what we visually, our human brains might do. But when we actually employ this, we just sort of not randomly, but we sweep back and forth over the image, covering the whole thing. And if ever the filter says, yes, I think I found an S, we say okay, we register. So I've sort of, again, I made this up here, but there are actually 4 S's in here, or sorry, 3 S's in here and a 5. And my 5 kind of looks like an S. And so I've sort of done the same indication of what maybe an AI might do in this case. It might look at the 3 actual S's and classify them as S. My first S on the Smallville bit here, that one is actually pretty well, and I'm pretty proud of how I drew my S there. I think it looks like a pretty good S, so I just pretended like maybe there was a high accuracy on that one. My other 2 S's were a little bit, I don't know, they're a little bit, I'm not sure, and maybe that means the AI is not sure too. So I've just, again, maybe indicated it has lower grades for that. And then we've got the 5. Now 5s and S's have very similar shape. They're not usually identical, and you can usually tell them apart. Certainly by context, you can usually tell them apart. But the AI here is not going to be using context. We could, but in general, that's not something we build into our CNNs. And so it's looking at this, and it might say maybe it's a S, but maybe it's a 5. Now here I'm only sort of showing you what the S filter is detecting. It's very likely that there's also a 5 filter. And the 5 filter is going over here, and on all the S's, the 5 filter might be like, maybe. It might be registering a 50, but the 5 filter on the 5 is going to be saying 90 something, we hope. And so what that means is, even though I've indicated here that the S filter might be firing off saying, I think this might be a S, there's a more confident filter somewhere else saying, no, I think this is a 5 and I'm really confident. And the way that the models usually work is at the end, we pick the one that's most confident. We don't, we might report all of the ones that think that it is, they've matched, but we usually report the highest confidence one as our actual classification. So that's just, again, an example of how a filter might kind of work. This is also an example of a high level filter. So detecting S's or 5s is not something you're going to get when you're with your first filters. Those are just detecting edges and boundaries and things like that. You need a couple layers on top of that to maybe build an S filter detector. At least that's my hypothesis, because again, I'm just working with a made-up example here. We're not talking about a very specific network. So I've sort of hinted at this already, but how do we represent visual data? Well, in the real world, we've got the sort of 2-dimensional representation in our on our retinas, and we use 2-dimensional representations all the time for our data in the real world. And so we treat images as 2-dimensional grids of information. Each of those information, we usually call that a pixel. And then how much information there is in that pixel is dependent on what kind of pixel it is. So in the, if you go all the way back, the earliest you might have is just a pure black and white. So your pixel is either black or white, or green and black, or orange and black, or whatever your monitor used to do back in those days. In those cases, you only needed a single bit to encode if it's just black or white. Now, of course, um, more likely you're going to have a byte to represent that information there, and then you could have sort of what we would call a grayscale. So there could be 256 levels going from black at 0 to 200 in white at 255. That's a one-dimensional representation of black and white images that will allow for gray, and then each pixel then would be 1 byte large. So we could have 1 bit if it's just either black or white. We could have 1 byte if we have black and white with grayscale. And then, of course, modern images are usually in color. And so to do color, at least on a minimal level, we usually encode that as an RGB vector. That's a vector of 3 different numbers. And so that's what we could call that 3-dimensional. And so that means our 2-dimensional two-dimensional image is of 3-dimensional pieces of data. And so every pixel is encoded by 3. Now you could also add transparency to that. We don't usually have that extra added dimension when we're processing images like this. So even if there was transparency used when displaying it for whatever reason, we're going to usually trace that out and only work with the RGB when we're processing our images. So what we're talking about here is just a little bit about the shape of what you can expect the input image to be. When you've got it as your neural network, what is it that you're getting that you have to process? Well, it's all this information, all these bytes, this 2-dimensional structure of bytes. And again, it might be a 2-dimensional structure of colored pixels, meaning there's 3 bytes at each point. So let's take this example. So first of all, let's start with the MNIST database, which is a very common, popular collection of handwritten digits specifically. So just numerals, no letters. And for that reason, it makes it, again, restricts our classification task even further. We don't have to worry about 75 different categories. We only have to worry about 10 different categories. So in this particular case, this was the task that the first convolutional neural network was used to try and classify, which is try and recognize these handwritten digits for what they are. So this database had a bunch of images where they had already pre-processed the images in a couple ways to try and make them good for neural networks or computers or machine learning to try and recognize them. The first is they cropped them, trimmed them, and centered the images in a way that made them easier for us to process through a neural network. One thing we need to do is we want to kind of restrict the size, because if they're really big, that means more input neurons, that means more neurons in general, that means more processing time, and especially when this was being carried out in the 90s, processing time was important. We didn't have as fast computers, and we didn't have as much memory. So let's just take one of these images. These images, as they are in the database, they are 28 by 28 pixels. So 28 by 28 multiplied is 784 bytes because they are black and white. An older version of this database actually had just the pure black and white with not a full byte with grayscale. And that was to do image processing, again, even before the 90s. But in the 90s, it was updated, and we also added some anti-aliasing, which is a graphics technique to, so if the line that we scanned in happened to sort of overlap between a couple different pixels, and one of those pixels only got a little sliver of that, in anti-aliasing, we usually color that pixel kind of grayish instead of, since we can't color just the corner of it black, which is what we want to do, we color it gray, which when you're not staring right at the pixel, kind of tricks your eyes into thinking like there's just a little sliver of black there, like the way that you would expect it. So again, this database is actually in bytes, not in bits, so that it could add that anti-aliasing bit in. But if we did want to calculate the size of the older images, they were about 98 bytes for a single image. But the 784 bytes, okay, that's not super bad for a single image. In fact, even in the 90s, that's not bad. But what is an issue is you don't just want to have one of those, you want to have lots of them. So there are 70,000 images in this database. So doing a little bit of math, that puts us at about 52 megabytes. And that was not the kind of thing that you wanted to, um, you know, pass around or have to store a lot in the 90s. That was a large chunk of storage space. Today, not so much. This represents a pretty small database, but this is what motivated back in those times for us to start building databases of images like this that were already pre-processed, that were already for our machine learning tasks, so that one, we can do our research on them, but then also we can use them as training sets for things for actual use, whatever that might be in the real world. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that, say you want to build a neural network to try and process these images. And let's say we're going to use the older model, which is what we've been talking about so far, which is the feed forward network, where we have a bunch of neurons. We have an input neurons, we got a hidden layer, and we might have 2 or 3 different hidden layers. And each layer is fully connected to the next layer, which means lots of connections. And then we do that a few times, and then we have an output layer. So that's a pretty standard. And in the 90s, this was a standard way to approach doing image processing as well, with some success. So there was definitely some success in doing this. But if you want to do that, your input layer, then we need to have one input neuron for each of the pixels that we have in this image, or each of the bytes that we have in that image. So we have 784 pixels, so we need 784 input neurons to process a single one of these images. Now that is a lot. Even today, that's a lot, in the sense that it's going to take time. When you have more neurons, it takes more time to train them with backpropagation. So you're always trying to restrict the size to help speed up your algorithm. So this was, again, another one of the motivations for convolutional neural nets, is to try and find a way to reduce that size a bit and reduce the learning. So those feed-forward networks are still feasible, but they're just, as we come to learn after we build in convolutional neural networks, they're just not as good at the same task. So I want to contrast that just a little bit with sort of modern high-def images. So you have a high-def image, a 1920 by 1080 sort of image. That image is going to be about 5 megabytes, or if you were going to process that image raw, so that every pixel is being processed by 3 neurons, red, green, and blue probably. To do that, you're going to need like 6 million neurons. That's a lot. Okay, that might be how many's in your eye. I don't know. So that's great. Maybe maybe that's what you need to do high definition processing in an actual human brain. But even today, that's kind of a lot of processing, and more so it's just going to take a lot of time to train it, and you don't want to wait that time. So as a result, it's very common even today to pre-process your images. You're not just looking at high-def images and trying to learn the whole thing right off the bat. You might be cutting it down into little pieces, scanning in the same way that I'm hinting that we're going to do as well. So this is just a common way to reduce the size, to make sure that the computational resources that we deploy are as minimum as possible. But then also, our neural nets want consistent input. So like we saw in that last example, they're 28 by 28 pixels. We want every single image we put in to be 28 by 28 pixels. So for that reason as well, we do some pre-processing of our data. All right, so I do want to introduce you to Yan Li-Kun and also Yashia Bengio, who were, they did this work with the first convolutional neural network in it started in about the late 80s, 1989, and they had a couple different versions of it. I'd say 1995 is sort of when they produced their most advanced version of their convolutional neural net for the character detection task. And then 1998, they have a really popular or famous publication where they reintroduced their strategy, and that is the sort of commonly cited paper. That's the one I have right here. This work was meant that they were awarded the Turing Award in 2018. Again, Turing Award being the most prestigious award in computer science. I mentioned in my last video that they earned this along with Geoffrey Hinton, who created or was one of the creators of the backpropagation algorithm, which is also an important part of the deep learning and the convolutional neural networks that they made possible. And so just to sort of put these two pieces together, what Yann-Li Kuhn and Yoshua Bengio and their team did when creating convolutional neural networks is they created an interesting structure of how to build the neural network. It's deep in the sense that it has more layers than you would normally see in a typical feed-forward, fully connected, hidden layer network. Why? Because those networks, if you put lots of layers, took so long to train that they were completely unfeasible with more than a handful of layers. But the convolutional neural networks were more efficient and able to process even with deeper networks. So they're sometimes called deep neural nets as well. So Yann-Li Kuhn and Yoshua Bengio were about building this new structure, this new deep structure, whereas Geoffrey Hinton contributed to the algorithm that trained that structure. Okay, now of course Yoshua and Yan also had to build in, or adjust the backpropagation algorithm to show that how it would work with their new structure. And their new structure wasn't just how to wire them up, but creating new kinds of neurons and new kinds of layers to process that information. So we're going to take a look at what was called LeNet 5, which was the one presented in that paper that I just mentioned. And it is a convolutional neural network that was used to process these handwritten images. So on the left, I have sort of an example of what a 28 by 28 handwritten image looks sort of up close with all its pixel data and with that anti-aliasing information on there that I was mentioning. So you can sort of see the gray squares in here as well as the black and the white squares. Okay. Now also, if you're familiar with graphics, white usually represents 1 and 0 represents, or black represents 0. And so we actually should consider this to be swapped in the information that we actually give into the neural net. And in fact, when you sometimes see these images posted by in other web forms, it's actually a black background with a white writing is what you see, because that's what the signals are. But in this case, we're just going to treat white as 0 and black as 1. So this is what the typical input would look like. And as I've already mentioned, it would be 28 pixels by 28 pixels by 1 byte, because each of these pixels has 1 byte. So in the architecture that we're looking at over here, the first layer is the input image. It's just whatever image we're pumping in, and it's going to have structure 28 by 28 by 1. So as I mentioned earlier, in the visual cortex, the two-dimensional structure is maintained. We're going to try and maintain that two-dimensional structure as we go. It's actually three-dimensional in this case because we're talking about how many pieces of information do we have stored at each one of those two-dimensional locations. Because we're doing black and white, we're starting with 1 dimension there. But if we were doing color, we might start with 3 dimensions there. All right, so what else does the convolutional neural net bring to us? Well, you can see here there are different kinds of layers that go on in our network. So there are convolutional layers. There are standard, what we might call sigmoid, or our normal types of layers, although this is a special kind I'll get to in a second. There are something called pooling layers. What pooling layers are trying to do, they do what we call downsampling, which makes a large image smaller. And why would we want to do that? Well, I already mentioned there's lots of computational costs to having lots of signals, having all of those different inputs, those 700 inputs. We want to have a smaller number of inputs. To have a smaller number of inputs, why not downsample them? So we have pooling layers that help us do that. And then we also do something. So at some point we decide, okay, all that structure, that two-dimensional, three-dimensional structure we have, we just want to now turn it into one dimension and do the old-fashioned neural network stuff. So the bottom of this network down here is just straight old-fashioned feed forward, fully connected neural net like we've been looking at so far. So we're going to take a closer look at how these different layers work. So the first layer is going to be the convolutional layer. So again, these are sort of the main important contribution from this new technology. In addition to that is the pooling layer, but sometimes we don't use pooling layers. Pooling layers are used to downsampling. If you don't need to downsample, you might not use them. What do the convolution layers do? Well, they manage our filters. Remember, we've been talking about our filters. So in processing our images, we need to decide on what size of filter we want to use, and we usually call that size the kernel. So in this case, we might say we're using a 5 by 5 kernel. That's the size of the filter that we want to apply. Okay, we usually are going to apply more than one filter, but for the moment I'm just going to focus on one filter. And so I've got an example of a filter here. I want to stress that filters, remember, are learned. They are not hard-coded in like I did here. I just went and colored some squares and said here's a filter, but in the actual neural network, the network learns what filters to learn. Now I've kind of made up a filter here that I think might look like an edge. I don't know. I just kind of made this up. But let's take a look what it's looking for. The pattern that this filter is looking for is a line of black, horizontal line with maybe some gray and then white on both sides. So it's sort of like a thin line. That's kind of what it's looking for, with maybe a little bit of gray. If we went and looked over at this image over here, if we look at this part of the image here, we can see that if it was hovering over, if we put the center point of this filter right over this pixel here, the 5 pixels that it was over would probably trigger very strongly saying, I think I see the pattern that you're looking for. And that's what the filters are there for. They really just perform some math. We do a little bit of matrix math to multiply the outputs of these values to whatever we're looking for in our filter. But when we do that math, the output is going to be a single bit. And that's, byte usually. So it's going to be our output of a neuron. Let's not give it a size. Whatever it is, it's going to be some number. And that number is going to be in a range determined by our network. But in this case, we want it to be firing higher, so a bigger number, if the pattern's detected, and 0 or a low or negative number if the pattern is not detected. And so that's what the filters do when they pass along. They just go along and we look for these patterns. Now, as you can see, the patterns get applied only to a small region. So we might imagine applying the filter in this top corner. And of course, that's going to give us one piece of information back, but then we can move it to a new location. And so usually what we do is we slide these filters along the image, and we do it each time we move it to the right by some number of pixels. In this case, I only moved it by 1 pixel. That's common, okay? This is called the stride. Okay, how many pixels you step across is the size of your stride. So in our example, we're going to be using a stride 1 here. So we would scan across. Now remember, every time we apply this, on the first time we get 1 pixel back. On the next time we get 1 pixel back. Okay, I say we get 1 pixel back. We get 1 piece of information back. Okay, and that information we might treat as a pixel, or we might render it as a pixel in a 2D structure, just like we do here. So as we go, we notice also that one of these applications overlaps with the other one. So we haven't skipped 5 to the right. We might do that. Sometimes we do that. We could pick a stride of 5. But when we picked a stride of 1 here, we get a lot of overlap between our filters. And remember, each one of these produces one piece of information. So when we're done, we've got a new two-dimensional image, if you like. I keep saying it's an image, or these are pixels, because we sometimes render what comes out of this layer and we show what it looks like. It's hard to interpret what it is because it's a filter map. It tells us where that filter thought it saw the pattern that it was looking for. So if we had drawn the filter map for this, unfortunately, because I did this by hand, I don't actually have a filter map that I could show you here. But if we had done this, if we had passed this filter over, for these few cells over here, there might be some black because it looks like, hey, I think I might see the pattern here. And we know for sure in here, these cells here would probably be black. But then we get white everywhere else where it wouldn't detect the pattern, okay? So we'd probably get a lot of white, some black in these few areas where the pattern is highly detected, and then some of these other areas that maybe look close that are matching some would be firing off some grayscale, and that's the kind of image we would expect coming back. So I call it an image because it's still two-dimensional, it still has numerical data in it that we could treat as an image, and so some researchers do when they want to debug or see what's going on in their filters. That's what they do. So this is the output of one filter, is we get a new two-dimensional chunk of data. Okay, so one thing you might notice here is that this is smaller than the original data, and that can be sometimes considered problematic. And so what we actually do what we often do, and what was done in LeNet 5 was we pad the data with zeros. And zeros, remember, in this case are white because zeros mean nothing's there. So we pad the outside with zeros. That allows us to start our trace or our scans in the top corner where we want to, and maintain the size of our image and not cut off the edges. Otherwise, we're trimming off those edges, which is usually not what we want to do. The other thing you'll notice here is that because we're using a kernel of 5 by 5, because the size of the filter that we're passing in this particular layer of the network is 5 by 5, we padded by 2 pixels on each side. Okay, if we had been doing a 3 by 3 kernel, which is also another possibility, we would only pad by 1. If we were doing a 7 by 7, we might pad by 3. And you'll notice that I've been picking odd number ones there. Often odd number ones are better for make the math work out, as we just saw that it's better for padding. And so we might stick to odd if that's something that we need to do. So I've mentioned this a couple times already because I really want to stress this, that the patterns that end up being in each filter are learned by the filter. The filter is updated through backpropagation, and it learns what it should be detecting. So if it ends up detecting edges, that's because it learned that. And so even though in all my examples here I've kind of hard-coded it, I just want to stress and emphasize that. So again, here are some hard-coded filters that I just made up. But let's imagine that maybe in LeNet 5 uses 6 filters in its first layer. Okay, so what that means is it might learn 6 different patterns to detect in that first layer. And why is that important? Well, if one of our filters detects, horizontal edges, we might want another one to detect vertical edges, or whatever else might be important features of our images that are worth detecting. And so these again, maybe it detects some corners, maybe some kind of diagonal. I came up with this one because I'm like, maybe this is what a line that would be in a 7. Okay, a cross. I don't know if there's lots of crosses in A, I wasn't thinking, but maybe an intersection, something like that. Maybe an X would be another one that might be worthy to detect. So again, I just made these all up, but when you normally do these processing with filters, you don't usually do just one. Learning just one filter is not usually considered to be good. There's usually lots of features you might want to detect in your image, especially lots of low-level features. So you want to accurately select how many filters. Now, LeNet 5 used 6. Is that the best choice? Maybe, maybe not. Since then, there's definitely been other attempts with different structures that probably have been more successful. So when you're done doing the convolution and you've got that two-dimensional image, if you like, of data, that data is not normalized because you've just perform some kind of matrix multiplication of some kind. So usually you want to normalize it somehow, and a great way to do that in a neural net is to pass it through an activation function. So here's an example of our good old-fashioned logistic function, and also known as the sigmoid function. This function is a it was commonly used in the earliest of neural nets. It was used for several decades as sort of, this is our, trusty activation function. It has lots of nice features, which is it squashes the output between whatever range we want. In this case, it's indicated between 0 and 1, which again is usually something that's useful. But after several decades of use, we started to notice that it's not all roses here. There's also some drawbacks. And one of the drawbacks I kind of want to point out right now is that you'll notice that we're doing gradient descent with these functions, right? And so that works really well if you happen to be in the middle here on this nice kind of linear-like looking piece, where if I land here, I know my gradient, if I want to go down, is this way. However, if I land up high, or if I land down low, depending on whichever side I'm on, my gradient is really close to 0. And this is a problem in backpropagation, because if you remember, what happens in backpropagation is we multiply by these slopes, we multiply by these gradients. And if our gradient is really small, like 0, then we are going to multiply by 0, and we're going to squash any corrections to that neuron or passing any error back to any neurons before that. So this is a problem in training nets. It can it's what causes us to get stuck in some of those local minima. And frustratingly, this occurs with this function, because a lot of this function, a whole bunch of this function, of its range, I should say, have 0 slope or very close to 0 slope. Only a very small, narrow part of this function actually has non-zero slope. And for that reason, it is, sometimes considered not a great function. And in fact, in image processing, it is not commonly used anymore, even though it was in the earlier days. And it has been replaced by a function, or I might call it a family of functions. This function, called the rectified linear unit, is an alternative activation function. You can see here it's very simple. Take the max of x or 0. Okay, what does that mean? That means if the input signal that's coming through is positive, we just pass it on out. Okay. What does that do relative to the sigmoid function or the logistic function? Well, the logistic function squashed it down to 1. This will not squash it down to 1. If your output is 1,000,000, your output is 1,000,000. Okay, hopefully your output's not 1,000,000, unless you wanted it to be 1,000,000. Maybe that's how your network works. Otherwise, if your output is going to be negative, we just squash it to 0. Okay, now this is helpful, because at least on the positive side up here in the activation space, we've got that nice linear slope, and no matter where we land on it, we're going to be coming down. So that it's never squashed to 1, and because when we squashed it to 1 with the logistic function, that turned our slope to 0. Our slope won't be 0 here. It's always going to be linear. Okay, specifically 1 if that's what we're using. So we can sometimes weight this. It does still have that problem about a 0 slope over here on the left-hand side. And we will sometimes call this being zeroed out. If the neuron ends up over here, it's now zeroed out. And same problem we had with the other activation function, with the logistic function. So again, some researchers say, okay, I like this part, but I don't like this side. What can I do about it? So they go out and they say, well, what if I made a little bit of slope over there? What if I make it a little slopey over that side? So this one's called the leaky ReLU, or the leaky rectified linear unit. So what does this one do? This one doesn't just squash us to 0. It says, okay, we're still going to have that linear slope over on that side, but we're just going to make that slope way less, because we don't want to go down all the way into the negatives. We kind of still want to do some squashing, but not a lot of squashing. So here my example was x over 10. You could use a different factor, scalar factor, whatever you'd like out front. Okay, so you could use some kind of parameter if you like. And in fact, that leads us into our next example, which is sort of the parametric ReLU. Now what this one does says, yeah, I do want to have a parameter out front there, but I don't know what I want. I have an idea. What if I make it a learning value in the neural network? So just like we learn our weights, we can learn this particular parameter as well. We'll just calculate gradients relative to it and go and correct it. So this is another version. We call this the parametric ReLU. And then the last one, at least I'm going to share, there are probably a handful of there's certainly other activation functions you could use. These are all just popular ones used by convolutional neural nets in image processing. The exponential linear unit replaces that bottom part with an exponential that still kind of squashes but still has a little bit of a slope. All of these have trade-offs. Like they give us back some positive thing that we like, but they often take away some, or they add again some negative thing that we were trying to get rid of. And so there's not really one activation function that is the best one. I think the ReLU is the one that is actually the most commonly used these days, but most commonly used doesn't really mean anything. The sigmoid function was the most commonly used in 1998, and it's now very unpopular. So if who knows, down the road another more popular activation function might replace the ReLU. All right, so let's pause for a second and take a look at where we're at. So we've taken our image, it's a 28 by 28 image, and we passed it through our convolutional neural net, which had those or convolutional layer, I should say, which had those 5 by 5 kerneled filters that we passed across. We used two padding. So we used the two padding to make sure that the size of our image didn't shrink when we did that. And then we applied 6 filters. We didn't just do this once. We did this 6 times with 6 different 5 by 5 filters. And so the output of that is going to still maintain the 28 by 28 structure. Remember, that's part of our goal, but it's now 6 deep instead of 1 deep, one for each of the filters that we've created. So we now sort of have a 3-dimensional piece of information that's being passed forward. Now, again, it's 3-dimensional, but we don't have to worry. We can have 7 dimensions. This is really just how we're representing the data and how we're thinking about the data and how we're processing the data. It can still be stored as one big, long, 1-dimensional vector if that's what we're doing in the actual machine. Okay, so the next thing we do is we pass it through an activation function. But when we're doing this, we're not having some big fully connected layer. We're just saying for every pixel that we've computed with our filter, let's just take that pixel and run it through the activation function. Usually it's ReLU, but back in 1995, 1998, when Jan LeCun was working on this, sigmoid was still the player of the day. So they use sigmoid function here, okay? So again, all it's done is taken each one of these pixels that was calculated by the filter, passes it through the sigmoid function, and then we pass that out. So here I've said that that's a one-to-one relationship instead of a fully connected relationship. What's the size that we get out the other end then? Well, we have exactly one of these activation functions for every single pixel in each filter we had out here. So the size does not change. Nothing has changed after this bit. Now, I've explicitly put this in here, but some representations of this architecture and of CNN architectures will kind of squash this out and just write maybe next to this error sigmoid or something, or ReLU or something like that, indicating what activation function is used on the convolutional net at the end, because usually you use a activation function on your convolutional layers. All right, let's look at our next layer. You can see the next layer coming up is called a pooling layer. So a pooling layer is, as I mentioned earlier, is used to what we call downsample the image. So right now it's 28 by 28. Maybe we think that's too big. We want to make it smaller. So we do that by, say, applying this region. We look at these 4 pixels and we kind of decide what we want to we want to represent those 4 pixels with 1 pixel, and we have to decide how we're going to do that. And it's very straightforward. We might not even consider these sort of a neural processing. There's no activation function. For instance, all we're going to do is either take the max or the average. And there's some other alternatives that have likely been cooked up, but those are the two most popular ones. Okay, take the max or the average. Now let's think for a second about what it is that we're doing. We're applying this to a filter map. So we've got some filter that's gone and said, here's where I think things are, right? Well, identifying where a cat is, or sorry, what a cat is it doesn't usually depend on where the cat is. In fact, most of the tasks we're putting these to, object identification and so on, where that image is not as important as what it is, the structure, how it is related to each other. So by shrinking that information, losing the information, we don't actually lose much in trying to identify what it is. We've just kind of made it smaller, and in some cases maybe even made it easier for us to identify what it is by reducing some of the information in that. So this type of downsampling is not necessarily as destructive as you might think it is. So when we're doing, for instance, let's look at the two and see what happens. When we're doing max pooling, we're basically saying let the maximum output of these four represent those four. Well, what that's saying is, let's say we have a face detection filter. Okay, it detects faces. And 3 of these say no face, and 1 of them says, yes, I see a face. What the max pooling does is it just says, if any of you are saying yes, then I'm going to say yes too. So if one of you thinks there's a face in this region, the 1 pixel that represents that region will say, I think there's a face in this region. And that's what max pooling does. And max pooling is the most popular out of these, max and average. Average pooling says, okay, well, let's average those 3. 3 no votes and 1 yes no. You can maybe already see why that might not be as good as max pooling, is if the no votes there overweigh the yes vote, even when there was a face there, that's probably not good. We probably want the face to be detected. So average pooling is used, but max pooling is more common these days. It's also common when we stride with the pooling layers to have our stride match the kernel size. So in the convolution layer, we like the overlap we have when we stride by 1. We actually kind of like that setup. But in the pooling layers, it's the opposite. We kind of like when we don't overlap. We're trying to make this image smaller. Now that's not a hard and fast rule. We don't always have our stride match the kernel size. Sometimes we have a little bit of overlap. But in this example, which we're pulling from LeanNat 5, the first pooling layer has kernel size 2 by 2, and then it also strides by 2. And so what that actually means is it's going to have the size of the data for us. So in this next layer that we have here, we started with 28 by 28 with 6 filters. We're going to pool on each of the 6 filters so we don't lose that dimension, but we're basically taking any of those 2 by 2 squares and turning it into 1 square, and that's going to have the dimension. Now I say this halves the size. That's not actually accurate. It halves the dimension. When you have the dimension of a 2-dimensional image, you actually make it 1/4 the size, because it's 1/2 of 1/2. 1/2 squared. So in this case, you can see the advantage of doing the pooling layer. It makes the size of our data that much smaller. Okay, let's do a quick check. 28 by 28, remember we calculated that earlier, it was 760 something, 768 or 86 or something like that. That number got 6 times bigger when we got to these levels. So now we're passing through 6 times that amount. But then after the pooling layer, we've shrunk that down to 1/4 that size. So I guess we're only at about 1.5 times the size of our starting image, which, okay, we still got bigger, but it's still not as bad. Now, why did we want to do this pooling layer? Well, the next thing we're going to do is another convolution, and we want more filters. Usually more filters is better. That allows us to detect more features of our image. The drawback of having more filters, of course, is that there's more of them, and it increases the size of the data that we're passing through, the more processing that we need to do. So you can imagine what maybe was going through Yan-Li Kuhn and his team's minds when they got here. They're like, okay, now we want to do our next convolution layer, and we want to have 16 filters. and they're thinking about doing 16 filters on the 28 by 28, and maybe 1995's processing powers kicked in and said, we don't have time to do that, we need to do something about it. And then they think, oh, what if we downsampled, what if we shrunk the size and then did the processing? So that's that next step. So they go ahead and do that, and then the next 3 layers of the network are repeating that same thing we've just done. And this is something you might see commonly in convolutional neural networks, is we do a convolution, we run it through an activation function, and then we maybe downsample. And then we convolution, which, remember, convolution increases our size usually by adding more filters. So we're sort of making it bigger, then making it smaller, then making it bigger, then making it smaller. Now again, if it's 2023, at least where I live, and that means we have a lot of processing power, and so maybe we don't need to downsample, so sometimes we don't do it, but at least in these early days, and it's been brought on, it's continued today. Why? Because we find that the downsampling is not actually that detrimental, and it does improve efficiency quite a bit. So let's take a closer look at the second set of layers in LeNet 5. So again, we're convolving again. We've got another 5 by 5 kernel. So we haven't changed the size of our kernel. What have we changed? Notice no padding on this one. We don't do any padding. Why? Well, that's a little bit of downsampling. Okay. The thing about not using padding is, remember, we got a smaller image out of it. But if we get a smaller image, the kind of downsampling that is done by convolution, remember, was trimming off the outside, not the downsampling that's done by the pooling layers, which is making everything smaller. Okay, so because of that, we want to be wary about doing the automatic downsampling, if you will, that comes with convolution, because that's going to trim the outside. And after a while, you'll trim off so much data of your outside, you're losing actual stuff that you want. That's why we zero pad, put data out there that we can trim off that we don't mind. But in this layer, they decide, no, we're going to trim it off. And it turns out that's not necessarily detrimental to the processing that they were doing, because a lot of the images had white space on the outside. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. Okay, we send that through an activation function, and then we do another layer of downsampling. So after the downsampling that came from convolution, we end up being 10 by 10, still 16 filters in this layer. So then we run them all through the activation function. That's not very costly, but then we do a downsampling. Why? Because we want to do that fully connected layer later on. And remember, those ones are computationally very expensive. We want to have as little data as possible. So they downsample again. Now we've just got a 5 by 5 sized image. That seems really small considering we started with 28 by 28. But those are images that represent high-level feature maps, hopefully, right? So they might be detecting 5s or 2s or 1s or 0s, the kinds of things that we're hoping to detect, or at least the parts of 5s and 1s and 2s and such that can be used by the rest of the neural network later on to learn what a 5 looks like and what a 2 looks like from those features that have been detected by the convolution layers. All right, the next step then is, before we can put it into that fully connected neural network, the old-fashioned one, we can't deal with the 2 or 3-dimensional data that we have. So we usually say there's sort of one layer that flattens the data. Now, in practice, you might not actually have to have a layer here. You might just have a little function that turns 3 dimensions into 1. So this layer is sort of like the pooling layers. They're not actually doing kind of neural processing in the sense that there's an activation function or something like that going on there. We're just changing the data in some way that makes it useful for the next layer of neurons to use it. So after this layer, we've taken that, there's 400 pieces of data there. You can check my math, but 5 times 5 times 16 is 400. So we've just stretched that all out into one big long thing. So basically you can imagine the first layer of this fully connected network is taking in these 400 inputs and passing it to the 120 neurons that are in this first fully connected layer. So these are fully connected again. So all 400 inputs go to all 120 neurons. Then these 120 neurons, all of their outputs go to these 84. And then these 84 go to these 10 in the output. Now, what are these 10? Well, these 10 are we can think of these as the output neurons. Now, remember, what were we trying to do in this neural net? We're trying to detect what numeral this is. So this one should say 4. So what we have is 10 output neurons, one each for 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on up to 9. And then each one of those neurons is going to have an output value from the network after we process this image, and we're going to look at those output values to determine what we think the network is telling us. So usually if we've trained the network well, if we put in this 4, what should happen is the output neuron number 4 should have a high output, whatever, 1 if we cap it at 1. These are sigmoid functions used in LeNet, so they would be capped at 1. So we'd want its output to be 1, and then we would want all the rest to be 0, because we're hoping that it's saying, I think this is a 4, but nothing else. Remember, there are some ambiguous numbers. In fact, I've just picked this 4 at random, but it's a little ambiguous. It looks like it could be a lazy 9. Like someone was trying to draw a 9, but they forgot to scribble the top exactly properly. So if the 9 neuron was kind of triggered on this one just a little bit, like not full on, that would be okay as well. And usually at the very end of the neural network, we have one last little method. We can think of it as a layer if you want, that interprets those neuron outputs. And it might be just a max. We sometimes use one called a soft max, which means we're just going to try and figure out which one is the biggest output. And if in most of well-trained networks like this, one should have a real high output, all the rest are low. So we just pick that one, and that's the output. All right, that was a review of LeNet 5, which again was one of the first convolutional neural networks, certainly one of the first ones we talk about. And then even though it was successful at its task, quite successful at its task, that the technology was used to detect postal codes in a number of different postal systems, the convolutional neural nets did not really gain a lot of traction and popularity in the late 90s. Partly because they were still underdeveloped a little bit. There was still some research that needed to be done on them. But also, remember that computing power back then wasn't that strong. And even if you wanted to apply it to color images back then, it just was unfeasible. And we needed some time to catch up. And during the early 2000s, there definitely was advances, both in the computing power and in how you might want to deploy one of these CNNs. And then this really started to gain popularity after a paper and a contest in 2012. The MNIST data set that we were looking at here in this video, it's of just handwritten numbers, but there are a whole bunch of different kinds of data sets of all different kinds of images for image processing out there that you can use. And there's one called ImageNet, which is a very large one that's sort of replaced MNIST as a popular data set to do machine learning research on. And in 2012, every year they tend to have competitions on it to see who can train the best model to do something cool with this net, this set of images. And in 2012, a convolutional neural net was used to, at the time, radically improve performances on the tests that were being done. And so I do want to just take a quick look at the difference in sort of the size and architecture between LeNet 5, which again, 1995 to 1998, used for handwritten characters, and AlexNet 2012, used for image detection, really high quality image detection, and what kind of layer size and shapes it had. So first of all, image size, we go from a 28 by 28 to now a 227 by 227 pixel with 3 color components. So we now have I didn't do the math on this one, what 220, what is, what that's going to be equal to a number of inputs, but it's a lot, right? Considering that we had a 700 and some over here, this is a huge, maybe a couple orders of magnitude greater. Okay, that's where the processing power is coming in. Okay, what kind of convolution do we use for our first one? It's a much bigger image, right? So they decided to use an 11 by 11 kernel with a 4 stride. Okay, curious and interest. I'd have to go read the paper and do a little bit more research to know how, what motivated this. It sounds reasonable to me, but you can see that this is what we will call a design decision that you need to make when you decide to use a CNN for your own purposes. What should my kernel size be, and what should my stride size be? And then as another one, how many filters should I use? And look, 96 filters, 6 over here, 96 filters. Okay, why? There's just so many possible things that you might want to be detecting, okay? And they've brought color in here. So some of those filters end up learning to just detect, oh, this is a splotch of red, or this is a splotch of green, or this is whatever. And then you can imagine putting those together, lots of splotch of red ones put together, means this isn't just a splotch of red, this is a red thing. Or, you might have red, green, what is this? I don't know, maybe it's a Christmas tree or a checkered a sweater or something. That the different patterns of combining those filters together can help you identify what things are. So having a filter that just detects what a red splotch is useful. So they use 90, okay, or 96. Notice here they're using the ReLU activation function. Now ReLU's become more popular for various reasons. Now they want to downsample. Okay, makes sense. They add a 3x3 pooling. We were doing 2x2. And they have a 2 stride. So there is a little bit of overlap. They're not doing a full 3x3 with a 3 stride. Okay. Another thing I didn't mention, in the pooling layers in LeanNet, they used average pooling, but in AlexNet they use max pooling. Again, max pooling is considered to be a little bit better. Some of these design choices that were made at the time because they were just inventing these structures, or because that was the popular design choice at the time, have been replaced by newer design choice based on more research. Okay, what about the next convolution setting? All right, now they're going to 5x5. Remember, we've downsampled a little bit. 2 padding, so that's fully preserving. And they decide to use 256 filters on this level. Okay, lots of filters. So it's kind of a small filter map. It's only a 26 by 26 filter map, which is smaller than the original LeanNet image sizes, but it's got 256 of these filters, okay, which is cool. Okay, because remember, the 26 by 26, that's what needs to be processed in some of these things. The 256 means just do that 256 times. So not until we flatten it down later are we going to start really scooping those filters into something else. So, okay, we still want to downsample. All right, we're down to 12 by 12 size images. All right, look what happens next. They end up doing 3 convolution layers with no pooling now. Now they've downsampled enough that it's kind of small, but why would we want to have 3 convolution layers in a row? That's that hierarchy. Remember at the beginning of the video, the visual cortex, the hierarchy of neurons that detect higher level patterns? That's what we want to get happening here. Edge detection, shape detection, okay, face detection. Who is this person? Is this my friend or not? That's the kind of patterns we want to start to be able to detect when we get up to higher levels. Look how many filters they're using here. We're using 384. Now, where did that number come from? I don't know. That one seems a little bit strange to me. But 384, squash that down to 256. We're trying to keep the same size at each one. We're using 1 padding to ensure that that's the case. Finally, we do a little bit of downsampling again, getting it down to, hey, it's the same size that they were using. Even though these images started at 227 pixels, these ones started at 28, we've downsampled it down to feature maps that are exactly 5x5 in both cases. Curious and interesting. Is this something that you can do with all image processing? I wish I was an expert and I could share that with you, but I do not know the answer to that. I think that would be something cool to look at. What's cool now? Well, okay, let's take those 256 filters we have, okay, and there are 10 of them, or sorry, those 256 filters we have, we multiply them by 5 by 5 or by 25 to figure out how many input neurons we've got there, okay. Can't do that one quickly in my head, but it's probably around 4,000. And then we're going to use fully connected layers. Okay, these fully connected layers, 120, then 84, then 10. The idea there being trying to shrink things down. These ones, 4,096, 10, 2 to the 12, 4,096 again. And then finally down to 1,000. I'm guessing there might have been 1,000 categories that they had to categorize in that particular ImageNet, and that's why they have 1,000 on the end there. Okay, so looking at that architecture, again, a little bit more advanced, but not using anything considerably different than what was presented in LeNet. Yes, we've swapped out sigmoids for ReLUs. Yes, we've swapped out average for max pooling. We've got deeper layers. This is definitely now deep learning and deep neural nets, and that is what popularized sort of the deep learning in 2012 and later. Is once we saw the success of AlexNet on images, we tried it on a whole bunch of other things, and there are much deeper networks these days, that hundreds of layers deep, that are used for some of the really cool stuff that you're seeing out in the AI world today. All right, I hope you like this introduction to convolutional neural nets. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in that next video.